Alô, boa noite. Não estamos na Globo News hoje. Também estou com meu celular aqui, mas não é porque eu sou da geração XYZ, e sim porque eu estou loucamente vendo todos os updates aqui do que está acontecendo em Israel. Já temos o Yossi Erev Tov. Good evening. So good to see you, because we spoke over the phone. A gente se falou 2 semanas atrás, mas nunca tinha se visto.
Nice to see you.
Good to see you. And what about your grandson or granddaughter?
My granddaughter Ella, our first grandchild, is 9 days old today.
Wow, Mazel Tov.
Thank you. Every day feels like a birthday.
I can imagine.
Really,
sure.
It's a pretty beautiful moment.
So, Yossi, vocês devem saber, ele mora em Jerusalém Oriental e ele está passando um tempo em Vancouver, porque a filha dele ia dar à luz e agora ele é vovô. E eu aproveito para recomendar muito, vocês já devem ter lido, muitos de vocês pelo menos, o livro Cartas ao Meu Vizinho Palestino, e é excelente, recomendo muito a leitura. E também, para quem tiver assinatura, é um artigo que ele escreveu para The Atlantic, 2 meses atrás. O título diz bem a que veio: Netanyahu's Betrayal of Democracy is a Betrayal of Israel. Tem um outro artigo que o Dado Wurtzman me recomendou ontem, eu estava ao vivo no ar, publicado no site australiano ABC. I was recommending your book and your articles. I read the one you sent to me, the one from The Atlantic, and I read another one you published at the ABC. And I'd like to start our conversation by quoting the title of the most recent one, published just 10 days ago: Israelis are turning against each other. Can the nation step back from the abyss? You wrote that 10 days ago or so. What's your take on that after today's events, and how crucial, pivotal for, Israel, the future of the democracy, of the state of Israel, have been the past 24 hours?
So first of all, hi everyone, and really delighted to be with all of you. And I just wanted to thank you for publishing me in Brazil. This is the first book that I've had that's come out in Brazil, and it's really thanks to all of you. And I'm delighted to be a Brazilian writer. So really, really very, very grateful. In terms of your question, what we're seeing today is an essential step back. We've taken a step back from the abyss, from the edge of the abyss, but it's a small step. And I think we need to understand that we've been given a reprieve for Pesach, and that's wonderful, that we're not going into Pesach with this terrible weight that so many of us have felt. That in itself is a gift, but it's really a small reprieve. And I don't know if any of you saw Netanyahu's speech to the nation, but there were a number of points that he made that were, let's just say, less than candid. For example, this wasn't his largesse. This wasn't Netanyahu acting as the leader he was supposed to be and bringing us back together. He was prepared to take us not just to the edge of the abyss, but right into the danger, God forbid, of civil war. He was prepared to risk the stability of Startup Nation, which is one of his achievements. He brought us, or was one of the architects of the modern Israeli economy. He was prepared to jeopardize that, prepared to risk the cohesiveness of the army. And without that, what do we have? He was prepared to see hundreds of pilots, reservist pilots, refuse to show up for duty in protest of his judicial revolution, which would have risked our ability, if we need to attack Iranian nuclear facilities, which also was his major policy. that under no circumstances will Iran be allowed to attain nuclear weapons. He was prepared, in other words, to jeopardize his own legacy for the sake of pushing through what I consider to be a frankly insane judicial plan, and whose purpose clearly was to extricate him from his judicial province, from his court case. So when Netanyahu stands up before the nation and tells us, I have decided that this has gone too far, and in my largesse, in my wisdom and my leadership capacity, I'm going to pull us back. The only reason he's pulled back is because we forced him to, because we've been out in the streets every week for 3 months, and we would have continued, and we may yet have to continue. But nevertheless, the fact that the protest movement has achieved its first great victory is something that I'm celebrating. I think this is a great moment for Israeli democracy. It's a great moment for Israel. Something very inspiring has happened here. We took responsibility for the fate of this country. You know, we do that as we've done that as soldiers, we've done that as citizens, voting, being involved. This time we really, we took the country in our hand, and we said, we're not letting go until there's some sanity restored to this process.
So I'd like to mention the pressure of the diaspora.
Don't hear you.
Okay.
Now I hear you.
It's
Yes.
okay. So diaspora Jews were key, maybe it's also a question, but anyway, 4 major U.S. Jewish organizations have welcomed the decision to pause the judicial overhaul. Their statement reads, "The last 3 months have been painful to watch, and yet a textbook case of democracy in action." It made me think of what you said when we talked over the phone about the main debate here, which is, what do we mean by a democratic state, and what do we mean by a Jewish state? Can you talk about it?
Yeah, it's you know, what makes this moment so complicated is that 2 things are happening simultaneously. On the one hand, there is Netanyahu's attempts to subvert the judicial system for his own needs. But on the other hand, there's a substantive argument that's unfolding over Israel's basic identity as a Jewish state and democratic state. And the problem is that it's hard to have a serious debate over Israel's identity, which we must have, so long as Netanyahu's shadow is hovering over our political discourse. So putting Netanyahu aside for a moment, looking at the issues that have opened up, there are 2 camps here, and who disagree deeply over what we mean by Israel as a democratic state and Israel as a Jewish state. The argument, I put democratic first because that's the argument that we're having now, even though in my own hierarchy of values, I put Jewish state before democratic state. If Israel, God forbid, were to stop being a democracy and continue to be a Jewish state, it would survive. But if it ever stopped being a Jewish state, it wouldn't survive. So for me, the priority is Jewish state, democratic state. But looking at the current debate, which is focusing on Israel as a democratic state, there are 2 basic ideas that have emerged in what we mean by democracy. First of all, there's the idea of this government, of Netanyahu and the Likud and his coalition partners, and that is that winner take all. Whoever gets a simple majority, if you get 61 out of 120 Knesset seats, you have the right to legislate anything you want. You can ban LGBTQ. You can deny Arabs the right to vote. you can do what you want because that's democracy. You're the majority. In other words, you have the right to use your democratic mandate to destroy democracy. That's one idea. And we know that dictators in the past have done exactly that. They've used their majority rule in elections to then turn around and destroy democratic norms. We see it in Hungary, in Poland, and elsewhere. The other idea of democracy is the liberal notion of democracy, which is that democracy is a very complicated balance between the rights of the majority and the rights of the minority. You have a Supreme Court to protect the rights of the minority. That's something that the government and its supporters have not internalized. They keep saying, what right does a court of 15 people have to tell us what we can do and what we can't do? Well, that's the job of a court, is to protect minority rights. Now, when I say that this is a liberal versus right-wing argument, I really want to qualify that, because I don't mean liberal in a left-wing sense. I mean liberal in a very broad idea. Liberal includes conservatives who are committed to the democratic idea of protecting minority rights. It includes liberals. It goes from left to right, and it's not an exclusively left-wing position. This is very important to emphasize. In Israel, until this government, what I just said was taken for granted. The Likud used to be a liberal right-wing party. Now, today, that sounds like an oxymoron. How can you be liberal and right-wing? But look at Menachem Begin. Look at Yitzhak Shamir. Every time that Meir Kahane, the far-right leader, would stand up and make a speech in the Knesset, and this is in the 1980s, Yitzhak Shamir would lead the entire Likud faction in a demonstrative walkout of the plenum. Today, Netanyahu has brought in the successors of Meir Kahane into the cabinet. Now, I think Netanyahu has betrayed the Likud. And the Likud that he has created in his image is a profoundly illiberal, anti-democratic party. So that's the first argument that we have. The second argument is over what do we mean by a Jewish state. And here again, we have two very distinct camps. There is the camp represented by this government, which believes that a Jewish state should be representing what they call authentic Judaism, which for them is Orthodox Judaism. So they see Israel as the state of Judaism. But classical Zionism, the Zionism of Herzl and Jabotinsky and Ben-Gurion and Begin, saw the state as being the state of the Jewish people. And the Jewish people is not some abstract ideal. The Jewish people is who we actually are. Some of us are religious, some of us are atheists, some of us are full Jews according to halakha, some of us are half Jews, some of us are intermarried. The state of Israel recognizes the Jewish people as we recognize ourselves, in our complexity. The argument that's coming, and I think this is going to be the next phase after the argument over democracy, will be about the law of return and defining who has the right to immigrate to Israel. And here we're going to see the clash between the classical Zionist position, which I define as liberal Zionism, the notion of a broad Jewish inclusiveness, versus a much more narrow idea of a pure Jewish people that is loyal to 2,000 years of rabbinic Judaism, which for the majority of the world's Jews today is actually not how their Jewish identity is expressed.
Getting back to what happens now, because clashes were still going on till a couple of hours ago. 38 people were arrested in Tel Aviv. Police was using grenades against demonstrators, protesters. And we know that Benny Gantz called Netanyahu saying, oh, I welcome, your decision, but let's have the defense minister, right, Gallant, back to the government. We also know that Itamar Ben-Gvir, one of the successors of Kahane, you were mentioning, he said, okay, our party agrees to this halt of the legislation, but we want the National Guard, and Ben-Gvir will lead this National Guard. So what happens next?
If you had told me a year ago that the successor to Mayor Kahane would be handed a private militia by the state of Israel, I would have laughed. I would have said, I don't know what country you're talking about, but that's not the country I live in. So what was inconceivable in the past has now become the norm. There is a very deep fight that is still going to happen. And you mentioned the people demonstrating in the streets tonight, even now, and my heart is with them. This is a very difficult moment for those of us who have been in active opposition to the government, because we have a very complicated decision to make. How do we continue protesting this government while beginning negotiations? And we have to negotiate. As soon as Netanyahu gave in to our central demand, we have to be present for that. And Benny Gantz is right about that. What worries me is that Netanyahu is going to try to use this moment to divide the opposition. There is the more wary, mistrustful wing of the opposition, and I certainly belong there. And I think most of the people on the street are in that camp. But there is the camp that still wants to believe that Netanyahu wants the best interests for the country. It's so hard, and it took me a long time, emotionally, to come to the point where I could see Netanyahu as a malevolent leader, as someone who thinks about himself before he thinks of the country. Look, I voted for Netanyahu in the past. I don't come from the left. I come from the center. And I saw Netanyahu as center-right, and he was in the past. Before his legal problems began, I think Netanyahu was an excellent leader. I supported him on Iran. I give him tremendous credit. He's the only world leader who clearly saw the danger of Iran and galvanized international opinion. And so it took me a long time to realize we're not dealing with the same man anymore. Something's changed. And I understand that there are still Israelis and still diaspora Jews who say, no, you're going too far. You're painting this picture of someone who's almost an enemy, God forbid, of Israel. So this is an issue that we're really going to be dealing with now in the coming weeks. How do we deal with Netanyahu? When you're sitting down at the table, is he a partner or is he a subverter? And I've reached my conclusion, and we'll see how others decide.
He posted on Twitter before his statement. He called on protesters left and right, his words, to be responsible and not to act violently. But what's happening goes beyond left and right, isn't it? Okay, the far right is not the story. And I know the center is very important at this point, but it goes beyond far and, I mean, it goes beyond left and right.
I so much appreciate that point, because what I think many Jews in the diaspora, at least in the American Jewish diaspora, which is the Jewish community I'm most familiar with, many have not yet internalized a fundamental shift in Israeli politics. We are no longer divided, as we once were, between the left and the right. That was true in the 1980s, certainly in the 1990s during the Oslo years. Today, the divide is mostly between the right and the center. The Israeli left is negligible. There's almost no left. Look at the Knesset. The Labor Party, which was the founding party of the State of Israel, the party that you couldn't unseat for 3 decades, the first 3 decades of Israel's existence, the Labor Party was undefeatable. Today, it has 4 seats in the Knesset. It is the smallest party. The opposition to the right is not the left anymore. It's the center. And the center is much more difficult for Netanyahu to defeat, which is why this movement, which comes from the center and not the left, is something Netanyahu couldn't deal with. This is a movement of patriots whose symbol is the Israeli flag. You look at our demonstrations, and what you see are thousands of giant Israeli flags. Netanyahu didn't know how to deal with this. Netanyahu knows how to deal with what he considers traitors. The left, the far left, they're barely Zionists, they're even anti-Zionist. Netanyahu is very comfortable in fighting the left. He doesn't know how to fight people like me, who are his former voters. Many of the people on the streets once voted for him. And so it's the center which supports a 2-state solution, but is very cautious. And this is, something I think for those of you who've read my book, the Letters book, I think you'll recall that I make a point in the book of saying, and this is not coming from a left-wing perspective. It's coming from a centrist perspective, which means I support a 2-state solution, but I'm very suspicious of Palestinian intentions, and I'm not prepared to rush into a bad deal. But I also don't put all the blame on Israel. That's one of the big differences between the center and the left. Left-wing Jews tend to put all or most or much of the blame on Israel. Centrists do not. Centrists know that we're dealing with a Palestinian leadership that has still not accepted the legitimacy of Jewish sovereignty in any point. And so in that sense, I'm closer to the right. I'm closer to the left in how I see a solution to the problem. So the fact that the Israeli political map has shifted and that it's now right versus center, on the one hand, makes it possible for the center and the right to speak to each other. We're closer to each other than the old left-right divide. But until Netanyahu leaves the scene, there will be no national unity between the two sides. And that's the tragedy right now. Netanyahu has to go because I'll say something terrible, which is just as I don't trust the Palestinian leadership, I don't trust my current leadership either.
And he's so pragmatic, isn't he? How do you see the law passed? Okay? Can you hear me?
Now
okay,
I hear,
okay.
Yes.
How do you see the law passed last week that drastically narrows the circumstances required to remove a prime minister, in this case, Netanyahu, basically shooting him from being ousted?
Now, if you look at the laws that this government has passed in the last few months, there's something astonishing here. We've never seen anything like it in the history of Israel. Almost all the laws have to do with protecting the interests of politicians, either Aryeh Deri or Netanyahu. We can't unseat Netanyahu. Netanyahu should be allowed to retain the $250,000 he received from his cousin for his legal problems. We've turned into a I'm going to try to coin a word here, a familytocracy. It's like our whole politics revolves around the Netanyahu family and his supporters. Where is the government's concern on social issues, on the role of the place of Arabs in Israeli society, education? I mean, this government is not interested in the issues that any normal government is usually considers to be its mandate. And so what we're seeing here, to my mind, is a government that is not normative and can't be treated as a normative government.
Israel has no bicameral system, no Senate, and no proper constitution in terms of checks and balances. Do you think the country would be better off with a proper Senate, a proper constitution? Is it time to write a constitution?
Yes, yeah. I mean, the time to write a constitution was 1951. Now in Israel's 75th anniversary, yes. The problem is that, you know, if we were dealing with the traditional Israeli right, the old Likud, the old religious Zionism party, we could reach a consensus on a constitution. I don't know that the ultra-Orthodox would be part of that consensus, and I don't know that the Arab Israelis would be part of that consensus. That's a big part of the population. Together, that's 35% of Israel. That's a very big part. But the broadly Zionist mainstream, from left to right, would be able, under normal circumstances, to reach a consensus on a constitutional framework. This government that has Ben-Gvir, Smotrich sitting at the table, to say nothing of the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox, and Netanyahu himself, he's not a partner for me. He's not a partner anymore. And that's the tragedy, because of course he once was. But his coalition is not capable of sitting down and coming up with a constitution that liberal Israel can live with. So I think that's going to have to wait for the next round. Compromise is always, or almost always, desirable. And I say almost always because it depends who you're negotiating with. If you're negotiating with the other side that has a minimum of goodwill, then compromise is necessary. Honestly, I don't believe we'll be able to reach a compromise with this government, because I think that their goal is to totally undo the power of the Supreme Court. Maybe not all at once. They realize they can't do this all at once, but I'm concerned about an incremental process. So, for example, the government has presented what they call a compromise plan, in which they would appoint the next 2 Supreme Court justices. Now, I have no problem with ensuring that there be some way of guaranteeing that there be conservative justices on the court. Israel is a conservative country. We are a right-leaning country, and the Supreme Court should reflect the makeup of the country to some extent. To some extent. The problem is that when you let the government appoint the judges, you're already politicizing the court. And in this particular case, one of those two judges that's going to be up for appointment next year is the position of Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. To have this government appoint the Chief Justice, who will then be in charge of Netanyahu's trial. One of the justices that apparently the Justice Minister, Levine, is considering as his Chief Justice nominee, is a man who in the past came out and said there's no legal basis for Netanyahu to be put on trial. In other words, his main qualification for being the Chief Justice will be that he opposes Netanyahu's trial. That, to me, is crossing every red line. It will destroy the credibility of the Supreme Court for half the country, at least. Now, you ask about the judicial activism of Aaron Barak, and you're right. The Supreme Court, and especially under Barak's influence, did go too far, and the proof of it is that half the country was alienated from the court. There certainly needs to be more of a sensitivity to an ethnic heterogeneity. There needs to be more Mizrahim on the court. I want to see more Arabs on the court, and so yes, there already are a number of religious Jews on the court. I believe there's one Russian immigrant. The court is not as homogeneous as the right claims. We have two settlers who are on the court, and so that will need to increase. Where I think that the critics of the court exaggerate the problem is in two areas. One is they accuse the court of undermining Israeli security by hampering the IDF from acting more effectively against terrorists. Netanyahu just said this the other day. It is absolutely untrue. If you look at the record, the court almost always will support the army. Sometimes they'll ask the army to adjust certain policies. For example, when the government came, when the defense ministry came to the courts and said, we're building the security barrier across the West Bank, the court asked the defense ministry to make certain adjustments on the route, but it supported the fence. The court has supported the right of the army to targeted assassinations of terrorists and on housing demolitions of terrorists. That's upheld by the court. So this notion of a, quote, left-wing court that undermines Israeli security because we're more concerned with democratic norms than with security needs is false. The second area in which the critics really overstate their case is by claiming that the court is power-hungry and it's trying to control Israeli policies. Now, the court has gone far in that direction, but I believe that its motive was pure, that the court was afraid of an erosion of democratic norms because we don't have a constitution, because we don't have a system of checks and balances except for the court. And so there was this sense of protectiveness of Israeli democracy that that motivated the court. But as we know, good intentions can sometimes lead to problematic results, and that did happen in this case.
In
So let's start with Smotrich. Smotrich is certainly right. The Palestinian people are an invention, but so are we. So are the Jews, so are the Brazilian people. Every people is an invention. And that is the definition of a people. A people is a group of people who gradually begin to realize that they have a great deal in common, a shared culture, a shared language, a shared history, shared ideals. And they recreate themselves from families and tribes into a people. The Palestinians have done that in the last 100 years. We've had a lot more experience. We go back 3,500 years at least. And so, yes, he's certainly right. But, you know, anti-Zionists play the same game with us. Well, you're not a people. You're not a nation. You're a religion. Thank you very much, but I know who I am, and please don't tell me that you understand my identity better than I understand myself. And if I'm asking for that right, for that courtesy to define myself, I have to extend the same right and courtesy to others. And the Palestinian people evolved as a nation, invented themselves as a nation under particular circumstances in opposition to Zionism. We helped create a Palestinian identity. There's no question about that. Inadvertently, but we did. Nevertheless, every people invents itself in response to its own particular circumstances. And so I think that we have to stop playing the game of who has the right to self-definition and who doesn't. In terms of what's happening here, you know, we've lived with terrorism for 100 years. The Palestinian national movement embraced terrorism almost from the beginning of the Zionist return. So the terrorism is not new. What is new is seeing hundreds of Jews burning dozens of Palestinian houses. And that is a pogrom. Some Israelis were uncomfortable with calling it a pogrom. They said, well, a pogrom is when there is mass rapes and mass murder. So let's call it a quasi-pogrom. Let's call it the first stages of a pogrom. But this is something new in Jewish history. We haven't seen anything like this before. And we certainly didn't see government ministers, if not outright endorsing the Harawa atrocity, expressing understanding for the pain of the rioters, the arsonists. Well, you know, if you go down that road, then you're opening the door to the kind of transformation of the Jewish people that was once inconceivable. And I understand that power creates a new dynamic for the Jewish people. And I celebrate that, the empowerment of the Jews. But power also imposes some responsibility, moral restraint. And we're a people that always celebrated restraint as well as the exercise of power. Judaism does not see power as evil. We never saw power as evil. We see power as a natural part of this world, just as Judaism sees every facet of life as being accessible to us. Judaism is not about suppressing, it's about sanctifying. And so everything is permitted, but how do you do it? You're permitted to kill under certain circumstances, but what are those circumstances? You are permitted to exercise power, but how do you exercise it? That is the essential Jewish question. And that's a question that the far right has no patience for.
I have two more questions. The first one is, quoting what you wrote in The Atlantic, the governing coalition of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is a mortal danger to our internal cohesion and democratic legitimacy, a historic disgrace. Is it enhancing, or can it enhance, anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism around the world?
Look, I really appreciate the question. And I worry about that. I have devoted my life to defending Israel. I've been doing it for 40 years. And I don't take that concern lightly. But there comes a time in the life of a people where the internal threat is so powerful that you need to turn inward, even though there could be difficult consequences. You have a moral responsibility to maintain your credibility, your moral credibility. That's what's at stake now in Israel. And if we lose our moral credibility, if Ben-Gvir and Smotrich and this government becomes the defining face of the state of Israel, then it doesn't matter what critics like me say about Netanyahu. It won't matter, because the disaster, the historic disaster, will come from the government itself. And that government is not defendable. It's not morally defendable. And I won't defend it. Now, I think we need to learn to speak two languages simultaneously about Israel. The first language is that those who want to treat Israel as a criminal state, those who would treat Israel in a unique way, to them we say, you have no moral standing with us. You are playing the same game that was played, the same dirty game that was played against the Jewish people for thousands of years. The game of double standards, the game of turning the Jews into the symbol of evil. And that, for me, that's my definition of anti-Semitism. It is turning the Jews into the Jew, and the Jew becomes the representative, the symbol of whatever a given society or civilization defines as its worst quality. So under Christianity, the Jew was the Christ killer. Under Marxism, the Jew was the ultimate capitalist. Under Nazism, the Jew was the race polluter. And today, the Jewish state happens to be the embodiment of racism, ethnic cleansing, colonialism, all of those qualities that our contemporary civilization regards as its most loathsome. So no, we will not step into that role anymore. We will not accept that role. At the same time that we're speaking without any hesitation to that camp, we need to acknowledge that we have moral issues. We have moral struggles. And I believe that in the end, it will be to the benefit of Israel's good name. I think that the hundreds of thousands of Israelis who've been out in the streets waving a sea of Israeli flags are a kiddush shem Medinat Israel, are sanctifying the name of the state of Israel. And I see it over and over again in the reactions I get on social media. That this sense of, this is an extraordinary thing. Here you have a protest movement, an angry protest movement, and their symbol is the Israeli flag. Now, in America, when demonstrators marched against Trump from the left, they didn't wave giant American flags. The American flag belongs to the Trump camp today. I think that's one of the major problems in American political discourse. But in Israel, we all own the flag. And when you see that, and when you see the demonstrators step, I think that this gave people who were ready to condemn Israel as a fascist state, I think when they saw this, the people at least who have an open mind, the people of goodwill, and we have to remember that there are many of those people, they saw Israel in a different way because of the book.
In Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, you said the book was like a message in a bottle thrown over the West Bank barrier. Considering the importance of the State of Israel for the unifying identity of the Jewish people, is it time for a message over a loudspeaker headed for diaspora Jews, including our audience this evening? And for that matter, what's the importance of institutions such as IBI, such as the Brazil-Israel Institute?
Well, it's actually the book that I'm working on now. And it would be great if it, God willing, when it comes out, if it would be translated into Portuguese. That would be fantastic. So the book is really an attempt to take stock of where the Jewish people is today, and how did the opening question of the book is, how did we manage to get from the lowest point in Jewish history, which was 1945, to the peak point in Jewish history, which is today. With all the problems we're facing, we are still, I believe, at the peak point of 4,000 years of Jewish history. We've never been more powerful. We've never been more important on the world stage. We've never had a stronger diaspora, and we've never had a stronger Jewish state. And so the next question that my book asks is, how do we protect the gains that the Jewish people made in the middle of the 20th century? Between 1945 and today, we did the impossible. And the question now is, are we still capable of maintaining that miracle? And I asked the question about Israel and about Jewish life in the diaspora. And so I hope that this book will provoke an internal Jewish conversation.
Yossi, thank you so much for your time, your attention, your patience. It was so good talking to you.
Great to talk to you, Leila. And thank you all for everything you do, for Israel, for the Jewish people. And I look forward to continuing to be in touch. And I'm very moved to have a relationship with the Brazilian Jewish community. And so thank you for the opportunity.